To make it clear, we could begin now, but we're going to allow a few more minutes for people to come in. But I just wanted to go up and check before we get going. I'm curious just a little bit about the crowd here. How many people here, this is their first time at a Drupal camp event? That's great. How many people use Drupal on an ongoing basis in their day-to-day? That's good, but not everyone, okay. What about, in terms of accessibility, what kind of skills and experience do we have here? Are we looking at people who've done lots of WCAG stuff, who need to, so how many very experienced accessibility people are there? There's a few, okay. Yeah, that's excellent. How many people here work in the government? Okay. Yeah, that's good. It's so important to go off and to have people at the government here, and I've been really trying to go off and push to have more people come, because government is trying to get into open source. Ottawa is a big space for IT, and there's a lot of opportunity and space for trying to grow and learn how to go off and to adopt open government and that side of trying to learn how to do government IT differently. So it's really exciting to see that, but also this is a great community to learn from. There's so much to do beyond just using open source. It's really important to try and actually have people who are get the culture and understand how the magic is done, so that the software actually gets built, because it's a little different. The whole ecosystem it's not just going to Drupal.org and hitting download and suddenly it's there. Like, there's a whole process that should give everyone a lot more confidence and security about how things are done. But it does take a bit of time to sort of get to understand how things are made. So the next question I have is just how many people are really excited about the presentation as I outlined it? Okay, excellent, yay! Because I can talk about all kinds of issues. So if there's people are like, I don't know, I'm interested in accessibility and whatever, we could just sit and talk, and we can go off and have more of a general discussion and focus in on what people's concerns and issues are. But there's also, I think it's, put some time in these slides, so I'm happy to go off and go through them. So, but we'll have some time at the end for people to go off and to ask questions and be able to explore things that may have been touched in the presentation, or if there's things that you have questions about at the end, we can do that. And after this session, there'll be a coffee and a coffee session that'll be outside, and then I think there's one more session, and then there's the Royal Oak and the pub, so that's where the real education happens, is at the pub. So, once you've gone through this and you want to absorb it all, you just have a little alcohol, have some direct conversations with people who've been in the community for a long time, and a great space to learn. Are we all, is it about good time to start? I'm not sure. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Somebody needs to ask, have you pushed the red button?
Thank you. And yes, it's all red. I've checked it out. It's red on the outside, and I appreciate that. Yeah, because I've not pressed the button in the past, and that's, yeah. So, oops, did I not go off? Oh, yeah, there we go. So this is the talk that Drupal is a base for an inclusive workplace. I wanted to go off and do that because accessibility is really important to me. I think that inclusion is a really difficult, challenging area, and often things are broken up and segmented. And I think that we can start to rethink and reframe how we think of Drupal, and we can start to perhaps solve some additional problems as we go ahead with our challenge of trying to go off and create an inclusive workplace. So this is me. A little bigger than that, but I'm a Drupal Core accessibility maintainer. I'm the CEO and founder of Open Concept Consulting. We're an Ottawa-based Drupal development shop. I think I'm the only person in this city who is a maintainer of Drupal. So anytime you download Drupal 8, my name is listed in there. That's only after thousands of hours of working with the community to try and get patches in and to try and build in accessibility by default into this amazing platform. we're not done all of the issues that need to be done for accessibility. Drupal's accessibility is not perfect. It's just better than everything else out there. So, if you're interested in going off and getting involved, or you find a bug in your testing and your use cases, we really want to have you involved and have you sort of feed into that process so we can address those. But yeah, it's a process, and we need you to be involved in the community to try and see that the software keeps getting better over time. So, what is accessibility? Does everyone here kind of know what accessibility is? Yeah, I mean it's pretty straightforward. WCAG 2.0, and then there's WCAG 2.1, and there's all these sort of standards and stuff. But I try to go off and so much of the time when people are thinking about accessibility, they think of like the people who are blind or people who have cerebral palsy. Like people think of it just affecting other people. But if you start to think about yourself and the people who are close to you and the people around you, it suddenly becomes not just a small portion of the population, like that 1 or 2% that might have some issue. But well, actually, if you consider just the list of people who have challenges with the web and with communications on the web, you're looking at about 10 to 15% of the population. So that's reasonably large. It's a large portion of the population that people write off. If you start looking at the circles around those people, if you take that 10 to 15% of the population and say, well, do you have a brother who has trouble seeing? Do you have a colleague at work who has cerebral palsy, and do you need to help people to go off into if you're a government employee and you have one of your colleagues is blind, they can't access their payroll stats for Phoenix, and it's like so there's people that affects in all kinds of different ways, and you may need to be brought in to go off and help people address these barriers that technology is setting up. And if we were to go through and ask people to stand up and if I listed off a list of disabilities and talked about not just people who are here in the room who might have those disabilities, but people who are in your sort of close circle of friends and colleagues, it becomes the majority very soon. And it's something that I think that this is, the disabled community is the largest single minority in our society, and it's a don't make me do the math on that, but I think I've heard that, and I'm going to requote it. But it's an area where a lot of work can be done to go off and to improve improve accessibility and make this a much higher priority, because it affects a lot more people than we think about. And sometimes it's also affecting people that we can't see that they have a disability. So a common case is one of dyslexia. That there's actually a reasonably high proportion of the population that has dyslexia. And in the tech industry in particular, you have a lot of people who are somewhere on the Asperger's spectrum, and they also have ways of trying to go off into things that they might need that would help them absorb information more effectively. So there's the visible disabilities and the invisible disabilities, and there's a lot of work to try and manage that. So big part of WCAG is the four pillars of WCAG are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Again, that's not anything particularly new, but it's useful to sort of break this down. And the big jump for WCAG 2.0 from WCAG 1.0 is they wanted to make it technology agnostic. They wanted to be able to see that the technology could, and the principles would be able to grow with the technology, because they found that with the earlier version of WCAG that there were things that they put into the guidelines that were suddenly no longer relevant. Like, you couldn't, in WCAG 1.0, you weren't supposed to use JavaScript. And then, the screen readers fixed that problem, and it was no longer important to just look at JavaScript. You had to go off and JavaScript was not a problem for screen readers. And it's taken a decade or more for some organizations to get over that and to sort of realize that, yes, JavaScript might be a problem for security, but JavaScript is not a problem for accessibility. Yeah, making sure that people who have issues with vision, hearing, motor control, cognition, And when we're moving into voice controls, that's a whole other area of accessibility too, is being able to go off and to control information through voice as well. So Microsoft came up with this little graphic, and I've never been as much of a Microsoft fanboy as I have been this year, both with Microsoft's adoption of open source and their drive to go off and to buy GitHub and to promote open source internally, and to have their CEO go off and say, we're into open source 110%, and they're really trying to go off and transform their organization, because they finally, after 2 or 3 decades of resistance, have decided that open source is actually good for them and good for the economy. So that's wonderful. But they've also gone off and realized that accessibility is something that they need to take more seriously as well. That Apple took a lead on that 10 years ago, and that Microsoft needs to catch up. So they've created an inclusion toolkit that you can download that has a lot of sort of frameworks. And one of the things that they added new to the framework is the idea of permanent disabilities. So that's the ones we were generally talking about. There's temporary disabilities. So you injure your hand at an event. If you break your right hand and you're right-handed and you're trying to use your mouse, well, it's going to be all really awkward for that time. Or you have a change of prescriptions, or you're getting laser surgery and your eyes get all blurry for a while. Like, this stuff happens, right? It's not going to be forever, but it happens. And trying to say, okay, this isn't just for us as we, at some future date that we have to worry about. This could easily be tomorrow, and it may not be forever, but it's something that is very much something that is could happen to any of us in some random day-to-day event that we need to be aware of. And there's also situational issues as well, and how do we try and think about the situational situations where we may not be able to see as well. Like if it's a nice day and you're outside and you're trying to use your laptop, good luck, right? Because there's often not enough contrast in the screen to be able to see what you're trying to read. Or even in a situation where you've got a crappy old tool like this, the projector here is really old, right? And it's like, well, if you have a really high definition presentation that you're trying to present that has a lot of grays and whatnot, you're not going to be able to see it. So, it might work fine on your desktop, but in the situation of me presenting in front of everyone, the contrast that I came up with may not be sufficient. Unfortunately, it is here, and this crappy projector is not going to go off and interfere with the presentation. But again, trying to think about things from a perspective of ability, and think about it differently. So again, you expand it, and you actually create a situation where you're doing this for everyone, because it's not just for those poor other people, but it's really for all of us right now, and situations where we're going to need to use this on a day-to-day basis. We're not all sitting in a dark room going off and looking at this technology with high-definition monitors all the time. So, thinking about the way that we use these modern web-based tools. Also wanted to talk about future or other sort of WC3. WC3 is the Web Content Accessibility, WC3 is the World Wide Web Consortium, and the Web Accessibility Initiative is a branch of the WC3 that has come up with a whole bunch of accessibility guidelines. WCAG 2.0 is one of them. There's also WCAG 2.1, which is the update of that. That was mentioned in Tiffany's talk earlier today, so that was great. The thing about the web is that, again, that people forget about it, is that the web changes so quickly. And WCAG 2.1 was released in 2008, 10 years ago, and there was a whole bunch of stuff that is now out of date, because there were things that we didn't think about enough, and one of them was cognitive abilities, and trying to think about people with learning disabilities, and how do you try and make sure that you're thinking about plain language and other elements like that in your content creation. So that's a great one, and Andrew McPherson is the other accessibility maintainer in Drupal, and he's been very active in trying to promote that within Drupal Core. Again, not that we fixed it all, because we haven't, but we've started to identify the issues, try to go off and work through those issues, and try and see that we're in a position where where we at least know what the issues are and are often creating the best practices that we need to go off and to implement them, not just for our community, but as an example for everyone's community. The other one is ATAG, which is the Authoring Tool Accessibility Guideline. ATAG it's a Canadian standard that was implemented at the IDRC, which is an amazing organization that's been around for 25 years here in Canada. But the ATAG is a guideline that most people don't seem to know about. But for institutions like the Government of Canada, it's baffling that they haven't invested fully in this, because it's the idea that you can if you want to go off and make your front-end website accessible, then it really makes a lot of sense that you're giving your authors as much support as they can get to go off and produce accessible content. So one of the things we did in Drupal 8 by default was to enable it so that alt texts are required by default. And I think we're the only CMS to do that so far. Drupal 8 launched a while ago now, but we require alt text. You can disable this, but by default, when it comes out of the box, you are expected to go off and put in alt text. And that means that for a content author, they're going to be more likely to put in content because it's irritating when they don't. Whereas beforehand, like for almost every other system, if you don't put in alt text, nothing happens except 6 months down the line when your site gets reviewed and you notice that there's an image that's missing. And then your manager gets an email and there's calls and it's annoying and people are upset and you hate to go back and fill in the alt text and you say, God damn accessibility, I hate accessibility, why is it always getting? He's like, well, if you built the authoring tools so that they supported you to make the decision when you were creating the content, you wouldn't have this problem, right? So it's trying to go off and to create the authoring experience so that it's as easy as possible for the authors to do the right thing. And the other part, that's part B of ATAG. Part A is trying to make sure that anyone can go off and use the authoring interface. Unfortunately, Drupal 7's been doing that since, Drupal's been doing that since Drupal 7. So you are part of our goal since Drupal 7 onward is for a person with a disability to be able to view the content, to create the content, to publish the content, to administer the website, and to do development on the website. Again, not that we're perfect, because we're not. This is a really complicated, challenging issue, but we're further ahead than anyone else. And that's part of why Drupal has such a huge amount to offer to institutions that are working on accessibility issues. The Government of Canada is really quite interested in accessibility right now because there's a legislation coming down into effect called the Canadian Accessibility Act that will probably will be enacted in June, I think. And that will not only affect the Government of Canada, but also all federally regulated agencies. So transportation, communications, Crown corporations, all kinds of stuff. So it's going to be a big deal for Canadians to go off and to suddenly have to go off and to have legislation that makes it even more important that the information is accessible, not just for public-facing individuals, but also for the people who are creating the content, and that there's an effort to try to make sure that these tools are accessible, that the ICT that we're buying, the information communication technology that the government and other institutions are using, has that accessibility built into it so that people with disabilities can actually do the work and create the content and engage and interact with people in using this technology. ICT is used in all kinds of different places. Like, I've listed a couple of them that are outside of government websites. But there's intranet sites, there's policies, finance sites, there's project management sites, e-learning, messaging systems, organizational archives. Institutions use technology to represent all factors of their organization now. Most of these interfaces that we are presently using are largely inaccessible, and they're often built on legacy tools that are not accessible. They're not designed to be accessible. Hopefully they're not built on Cobalt, but they're certainly not forward-thinking, mobile friendly implementations of tools that allow people to go off and to engage with their jobs on the go. And they're definitely not built for accessibility. And if I think that a lot of these will go off and be there'll be millions spent by governments and other agencies to go off and to take these existing legacy tools and to rebuild them to be accessible legacy tools, which is going to cost a lot more than replacing them with open source tools that have got accessibility built in. And the best example of this is Drupal. It's far easier to go off and to start with a good platform and to make sure that you're taking a good platform and having and to work with accessibility in that platform, in that space, than it is to go off and to take your old legacy tools and trying to find accessibility experts who can go off and to test and evaluate all of the quirky little components of your website to see that it does what it needs to do for the accessibility of today, because the internet changes quickly, right? And you're in a situation where once you've invested in the fixes today, you need to not only sort of fix it for today, but also maintain it, because in 6 months' time, the browsers are going to be different, the assistive technology is going to be different, like everything changes. So you can't just find a solution that works for today. You need something that's future compatible and that has a larger community that's actually working on these issues, which again gets back to Drupal. Skip that part. Most ICT is less accessible than Drupal. There's a lot of proprietary pieces where it's difficult to go off and think about how you would go off and do that and who would own the intellectual property behind it. Has anyone here had to go off and work on the Adobe AEM implementation? Sorry about that. That's not my fault, but I'm sorry that you've had to do that. There's a question about a lot of work has gone into making Adobe AEM more accessible than it was previously. Who owns that? The IP that went into that, paid for by the government of Canada, who owns that? Like, it's ridiculous. And the other thing is just to go off and to, so many things. But I will not go there. So I do think it's worthwhile to go off and note that WordPress is actually doing quite a lot, and I'm quite happy to go off and say that the WordPress community and the Drupal community are trying to coordinate together and to do more stuff as a group. And it's interesting when you think of those two open source communities and the power of that, because that's 30% of the internet right there. So if you can get 30% of the internet to agree to a common pattern that works for them as a default, then the browsers and the assistive technology will have to go off and play along. I mean, that's a much bigger piece of the pie than any single other entity has to play with. And the Drupal community and the WordPress community working together can do a lot to go off and make sure that we've got open standards built in that allow us to go off and to build in best practices, and we're not having to constantly chase around these proprietary tools like JAWS to try and find out what they're, or JAWS or VoiceOver to see that they're doing something that actually works. Drupal is a bit of a Swiss Army knife, and it can be used for a whole bunch of different stuff. We worked on BuyandSell when it was in its pilot phase. We built the pilot of BuyandSell.gc.ca, and that was a really interesting project. But right now, BuyandSell is essentially just a front-facing website for a whole bunch of back-end databases, as I understand it. It's been years since I've worked on this. But it's, all Drupal does is provide that front-end interface so that there's a nice searchable front end for a back end of existing government services. So Drupal takes care of the accessibility and whatnot. We've got a project management system that we're running with Drupal. We've built e-learning systems, and there's a range of e-learning systems out there as well. There's a really amazing one called Elms that Brian Olendijk is the guy behind that, and you just sort of look at what he's doing with the Hacks the Web project and some of the blow your mind accessibility, or the blow your mind work he's doing on web components and rethinking how the web is constructed and how you can use the web as a platform for so much more. It's amazing. And this is just, they use Drupal and they've gone off and pushed this forward as a much bigger component for how to go off and to rethink how educational institutions can think about how to define their content and engage with their content authors and build something that's easy and useful for people. The other thing is I love this example from Health Canada. I think is Colin Stewart here? Not Colin Stewart, Colin Schwartz. No, I don't think so. So Colin is in the conference, but Colin went off and was involved in this project, I think, which is Health Canada has a project where they're using Drupal as essentially a validator. And I don't know that this is the perfect tool for Drupal, but they're using it to go off and to take Microsoft Excel files, suck it into a Drupal database, validate that the content is all needs to be there, and then it's exporting it to a DB2 database, because that's what Health Canada needs to go off and keep track of their information. It's like, but you're using this for, like most people when they're thinking about Drupal, they just think of the front-end website, and you're using Drupal for something that is neither the front end or the back end of your system. You're using it as this crazy middleware that's sort of custom designed to go off and do this thing for you that your organization needs it to do. It can be used for a lot of other things, and if you're trying to go off and think about making your organization more inclusive, it's useful to try and think about the fact that the back end of Drupal has gone through extensive accessibility reviews to see that back end is very accessible, and the front end is also very accessible. So depending on what you're trying to do, and if accessibility is one of your challenges, using Drupal as a way to go off and to tie into your old legacy system might be a way to go off and to resolve one of the problems you have about trying to go off and meet the legislation as it comes in June of next year. I do love the line, culture eats policy for breakfast, and that's definitely true. One of the great things about bringing people to events like this is that this is a space for people to learn and to bump into get together over coffee, over beer, in the sessions in the hallways, to sort of find out what are the new ideas, what are people doing, what can you learn that you hadn't thought of before. And it's part of this culture change that I think needs to happen to move from the heavily siloed environment that so many institutions are in, into one that is open to having those cross-disciplinary discussions that will actually allow us to go off and to move as quickly as we need to and be as nimble as we're required to be in order to go off and to meet the security, accessibility, usability, performance requirements that we're trying to go off and to achieve. So it's we can learn from each other. The other thing with accessibility in particular, I like the idea that you can use open source to test ideas, and you can use open source to go off and find what is the best practice. There's so many times in Drupal where I've run into a problem where it's like, well, what is the best practice for X? And there isn't one. And so like nobody's posted a best practice on how to go off and address this particular accessibility issue or that accessibility issue. So it's like, well, maybe what I can do is post an issue on the community and ask for support. Maybe I can go off and post an ongoing issue to try and address that and find a way to go off and to learn with the community. So I'm not just answering my accessibility problem, but I'm trying to address this for everyone. So a great example that we're currently looking at is drag and drop solutions. It's a really hard challenge to try and go off and figure out how to go off and handle with that visual design layout that so many people want to move towards, and accessibility, where you may not actually have the ability to go off and to explain relationally where things are between left, right, up, down from all this other blocks of content. It's easy to see visually when you're moving a mouse over what you want to do, but how do you describe that so that it can be managed by a person using a screen reader? How do you make it so that somebody who's using Dragon Naturally Speaking can go off and control the placement of a block and the movement of a block verbally with their voice? And like these are not easy questions, and there's no real answers to them just yet. But we can either decide we can't do these, or we can decide to work with the community to try and find examples out there to try and build a best practice that we can test out and evaluate and find ways to move the yardstick forward. But this is going to take years of work and years of investment in order to try and address these bigger accessibility challenges. It's coming for the amazing tech is great, but a lot of people stay for the community, and I think that's something that's important to try and remember, is that the culture of how to go off and to to learn what people who are excited about this space and this technology and are able to actually do amazing stuff together and can work together in new ways, that you can compete, you can collaborate with your competitors, and you can share ideas that you've spent hours and hours working on and feel good about giving away your hard sweat and labor for free, because you're benefiting from the work of thousands of other people who've provided their hard-earned blood, sweat, and tears into the project that they're working on. So a quick question: does anyone know how much Drupal is evaluated? If you were to go build Drupal from scratch, how much it's going to cost? There's one estimate that the price to go off and build just Drupal Core, if you're going to pay people like, I think it's $55,000 a year to go off and to develop it, the years of effort that's gone into developing Drupal Core, it would cost you $31 million to go off and develop Drupal Core. And you're getting that for free. So just, $31 million worth of software for free. So yeah, simple arguments for accessibility. Yeah, any day now you might need it. It's something that's that whole future case. I also like to go off and argue again about the baby boomers. How many people here have a manager that's a baby boomer? Okay, well they're going to have trouble seeing stuff in small font and light gray. And I am not a baby boomer. But it's a real challenge to go off and to deal with this population. This is a group of people who have a great deal of economic and political power and have never been denied anything. And I think that they're not likely to go off and stop having their expectations met. So in terms of the value of accessibility, people with disabilities represent a big chunk of there's a lot of dollars behind it. And this is from a UK enterprise survey, and they said that 71% of users that had accessibility needs clicked away if they found the site difficult to use. That portion of the population was 10% of the economic spending power of the UK. So that's a lot of people. If you have a website that isn't accessible, you're potentially losing 10% of your customers. And most people aren't thinking that way, because they're like thinking about the blind user. And how many blind users go off and sign up for enterprise anyways? I don't want the blind drivers on the road, so thank you very much. But it's not that, right? Thankfully, it's not that. 82% of customers with accessibility needs go off and they spend more time on it if they knew that the site was accessible. I think it's also useful to try and think about hiring people with disabilities as well, and part of that's to try and think about how do you actually know that this technology works. And if you bring people into your organizations that has a disability, then they're going to be able to empathize more with other people who are not part of it, with the outside. If you hire only able-bodied 20-year-olds, there's a limit to that, to how much they're going to be able to empathize with the needs of your real users. It's also, I think it can be really important for other staff to go off and to have more loyalty and a better sense of why are they feeling good about their job and what they're able to do if they're sort of, again, working with people with a variety of different needs, and can make sure that there's greater employee loyalty that way as well. People with disabilities also have above average attendance records in many cases, and there's a lot of people with disabilities who are looking for work. But if we bring them into our workplaces and we don't have technology that they can use, then we're not going to be able to keep them on staff for very long, or they're never going to be very effective, because they're not going to be able to do the basic things that everyone else does, because the intranet site isn't accessible, and they can't edit a blog post because it requires some weird thing that some custom solution, or if we're going to try and include people into our workplaces who have disabilities, we need to try and make sure that we're thinking ahead and buying technology that they can actually operate. So again, that's stats on trying to go off and support hiring people with disabilities, and the performance rating of those people, because there's a lot of skilled people who are in the workforce who need to go off and who who are being excluded from jobs because they have a disability, and it's hurting all of us, because there's definitely a job shortage out there for people who are qualified to go off and to work on the issues that we need to do. I said I'd go off and talk a little about stuff that's missing in Drupal 8 as well. We've just scratched the surface on A tag. I would love to go off and have something in A tag that actually started to plug in with artificial intelligence, so that you could actually get some suggestions of alt text that could be used. I'm very, very skeptical of anyone that is using alt text to replace an author. I really don't think that I will see in my lifetime artificial intelligence that is able to go off and to read or understand the image, and that's actually not that complicated. But what we need to do to provide useful alt text is understand why I chose that image and how that image relates to the content that it's next to. And because a lot of images, like, depending on what it is, you want to have a different description of that text. We don't want to go off and, if I took a picture of you, it would be an audience. Like, well, how useful is that? Like, it's not, the AI is not going to know that it's an audience of people at Drupal Camp Ottawa, right? So, or that this is the session, the accessibility session, and I was the presenter. Like, AI isn't going to know that. But there's stuff that we could use to try and make it easier for authors to create better content. Plain text is another one that we could start incorporating into Drupal to make sure that there's some evaluation of how complex the text is. Is the text is it written for a university level? Is it written for a grade 6 level? Are certain authors likely to go off and write on one level or the other? Because if you're trying to write for an organization, you want to have some consistency, and you want to be able to start writing for people who are moving throughout the world and reading your content on a bus, or while they're bouncing their baby on your knee, like all kinds of stuff. So, like, trying to think about writing in plain language is quite important. Again, WCAG 2.1 has just started. We've barely addressed that. Tiffany mentioned automated testing a little bit, and some of the stuff that I think Marcy Sutton is a person that's done a lot of this ground, but also the group in Australia called Previous Next. Previous Next actually developed the AGov distribution that the GovCMS folks in Australia went off and copied. So the Australia Drupal government community uses a distribution started by this great group in Australia that's been doing some amazing pioneering work with the Drupal community for years. We have really terrible support for Dragon Naturally Speaking right now. I don't have, like, voice controls are a really important part of the puzzle. People have cerebral palsy or other issues are using voice to go off and to navigate through a website. And we don't have enough people who know how to go off and to work with voice control and management of that, to be able to say, well, what works and what doesn't. We need to clean up ARIA. Again, ARIA, as Tiffany mentioned, is the accessible, rich internet applications. It's all of the stuff that allows you to define additional semantics that with the dynamic content on your web page. And testing, lots more testing, because every 6 months every time a new browser is released, every time a new assistive technology is released, every time we're starting to use Drupal in some other way that we didn't think of a year ago, there are places where new issues are identified, and that we need to go off and to fix those issues and then start to work on them. One of them we've started to work on recently is actually tied to VIMs. Anyone know what VIMs is here? VIMs is visually induced motion sickness. It's all of the dynamic elements of web pages that people like to add because it makes it look cool and interactive, but makes some people throw up and feel nauseous for days. So it's crazy that your website can actually make people sick, literally, but it can. And we want to go off and build into Drupal Core a mechanism to turn off animations so that we're not making people nauseous from the websites that we create. So that's, again, something that we need to deal with. And Firefox just got support for a standard to disable the motion. Like there's a Mozilla, or there's a tag that the WC3 put out that the Firefox is just supporting now, and Internet Explorer supports it. I think Chrome is the only one that doesn't support it at this point, but hopefully that will happen fairly soon. There'll be enough people on board with disabling motion that we can have simpler, easier interfaces that benefit most users, or many users. In terms of themes and modules, we're looking at evaluating different themes and modules. There's nothing in Drupal for trying to go off and provide an accessible, ready theme or module. I do love that the WordPress community is doing this, and that they're trying to identify the leading themes and modules that are out there to go off and to use. And hopefully the Drupal accessibility team will grow, and we'll have resources to go off and to start evaluating that and providing that. Right now, if you're looking to go off and start with an accessible theme, I would look at classy, Zen, or adaptive theme. And frankly, the Government of Canada does have the Web Experience Toolkit, and I am a really big fan of the Web Experience Toolkit, except it's not being actively maintained, so it is no longer really relevant.
That's not true.
It's not being as maintained as much as it was 2 years ago. There is some movement on it, but it's not like it is previously.
Sorry, I need to clear something up here. So
Good.
we actually have people working for Business Canada on WXT.
Yeah.
And it's maintained, the security patches.
No. The framework. The web experience.
Webbound,
What's that?
that's also maintained. They have.
But it's previously when it was managed under Treasury Board, every 6 months there would be a full review of the suite to go off and evaluate that it was meeting the WCAG standards. That is not being done, and it needs to be done. And if you're going to rely on this, not that the Classy, Zen, and Adaptive theme go off and are doing this, but there's a much bigger community that's looking at these issues, and so I would recommend starting with one of those themes, unless you're dealing with a Government of Canada site, in which case the Web Experience Toolkit has all of what you need for the common look and feel. Contrib modules, there's lots of ways to go off and extend accessibility within those as well. And you can look at what are in the issue queue, you can see which are being tagged for accessibility. There's a common accessibility tag that you can look at to find issues and see where the issues have been identified and what issues have been fixed. Most people here probably know this, but one of the other things that's quite unique about Drupal is there's a Forms API there's APIs for a lot of stuff that centralizes how different pieces are built of the website, and the advantage of that is that we can fix accessibility issues in Core, and then when you have a module or a theme that uses Core, it will go off and it'll take those best practices we built into Core and apply them. So if you're building a form, which can be quite difficult to make a form accessible, if you're just building a form using Drupal best practices, it will inherit all of the accessibility best practices that we've built into Core, and you will have a quite accessible web form out of the bat without having to do any testing, and it'll be consistent with your other web forms because it's all built with a central API that's being tested quite thoroughly to see that it's bringing forward as much semantic information as possible to help your assistive technology be able to navigate that information. I also recommend for basic testing, the two things, there's lots of testing tools out there. Axe is definitely a great one. Tenon is a good one. But for most users, if you're new to accessibility, the Wave toolbar is really useful. If everyone just went off and used the Wave toolbar for looking for red banners and then made sure that they tried to navigate the website without a mouse, if everyone just did that, we would have so many fewer issues. There are so many. The most common accessibility issues are things that are super easy for the Wave toolbar to go off and to pick out, and that can be easily discovered by somebody with almost no training who's trying to go off and just tab through the website, and if they can't figure out where they are or they get stuck somewhere in the site, it's not accessible, and a screen reader won't be able to access it either, most likely, if it gets stuck. So it's like they're easy shortcuts to try and to identify some problems with existing websites. I like to throw in a slide about free as in kittens, because I like kittens, but also because people talk about free as in beer, free as in speech, but I think free as in kittens is much more important, that you can, all of the software needs to be maintained. It's a huge amount of software that you're getting for free. And if you think about it as free as in beer, you're not going to think about how you can contribute it back to that, to go off and nourish it, to see that it's there. If you think about it like a kitten, you can go off and say, wow, that's amazing, and I'm going to have to feed it because I want that cat not to rip out my eyes tomorrow. And I want that cat to go off, and I want to train that cat so that it does what I want it to do and is nice to live with and nice to work with. So I'm going to invest in that kitten to see that over time it's a product that I can cohabitate with and that I can grow to love and that suits the needs that I have as an individual or as an organization. So yeah, trying to think about open source as free as in kittens, and the accessibility community definitely needs more people contributing to that, because that's, yeah, there's not that many people who are actually doing the hard work of making this software accessible. And that's me, and that's Open Concept. So we can now, if there's questions, happy to answer any questions you guys have.
So you mentioned in the last few slides about the free themes that you can use.
Mm-hmm.
For now, there's just those 3 themes, but in the future,
I mean, there are certainly other ones as well.
Yeah, how do you know that this theme is accessible enough before you apply it and then test it? Is there a way to know that? And in Drupal?
Not in Drupal, no. In WordPress, there is that tag that has, where there's the accessibility team goes off and has evaluated several of the themes, and they have a process that they use to go off and evaluate it.
Okay.
But there isn't in Drupal. So there's the, but it's yeah, Zen and Adaptive Theme have both gone through a lot of accessibility review and work. And Classy is, and actually any of the core themes are also ones that have gone through a lot of accessibility testing. And there certainly are other ones that are out there, but there's so much you can do with those. And you know, yeah. Does that make sense? Yeah. Nathan?
Just a comment more. So when we do accessibility, one of the things that we notice is, I mean, you can use accessible everything, but the hard stuff is the last 20%.
For sure.
You know, like, for example, if you just take it for granted, apply accessible things, and you think your job is done, it's also you have to train people to do the right alt tags.
Yeah.
You have to make sure the content is inherently accessible to screen readers on an ongoing basis. So it's not just about the software, it's also about the stuff on top of it.
For sure. Yeah.
So how have you helped your clients with that last 20%?
Oh, good question. We've certainly tried to go off and provide training and to do things like when we're creating things like Drupal 8 has CK Editor built into it. But whenever we're delivering a WYSIWYG editor to users, we want to go off and limit the amount of options that are there and to disable the ones that are not semantic. Like, we want to be able to, like, no user of a WYSIWYG editor should be able to use an underline. That should be removed because that should be a link. You should never be able to add a font. Like, that's not something that should be in a WYSIWYG editor. That's not a semantic thing that a content editor should be able to manage. You should, what else? There's a whole bunch of stuff that is not semantic, that is visual, that you might want to build in. Like, we'll go off and build in, if they want to have visual elements, that we'll create custom CK editor elements that allow, or custom CK editor templates that allow us for them to wrap an element around and make sure that they've got something that gives them that control without actually giving them the ability to start messing with the HTML and screwing up the semantics, trying to bundle in packages that are easier for them to repeat. We also definitely try and see that they're pointing to the right, like, training is so important, and that they're aware of the videos that are available, and the fact that once we launch the website, it's not done. that there's an ongoing work to try and change the culture of the organization and the content editors to see that there's efforts to go off and to review that. We've also tried to go off and change the procurement system to try and address accessibility. I've got a whole GitHub page on this where I'm trying to grab examples of good procurement for accessibility because the whole procurement model really should be structured so that accessibility is not sort of like a bullet point, must be WCAG 2.0 AA compliant, which sort of, it's a nice goal, but it's really hard to go off and to meet, and it's also something that it needs to be maintained. Like once you launch the website, that and your users start adding content to the website, then what? You need to go off and actually make sure that you have a system that can be maintained and that the users are able to have what they need, whether that's just the documentation about what are the best practices, or making sure that accessibility best practices are discoverable, and that the users have the access that they need to be able to see the help text that's available so that they're aware of that. But yeah, training is a huge part of it, trying to go off and make sure that people have conversations. And also suggesting things like regular reviews of websites are still useful. Suggesting a point where you have an audit of your site every year. You spot check a couple different pages to go off and say what are these 5? Are there any accessibility issues that we didn't know of a year ago, and how should we try and deal with that? What are the things that we didn't discover last time? Because there's going to be things. I've got a talk on security and accessibility and performance, and how there are many of them. They're very similar kinds of problems, and if you treat them as they're treated the same way or mistreated the same way by tech, there's people sort of assume that once you've got a secure product or a secure piece of software that it's secure forever, and that's just not the case. You have to keep maintaining it over time, and same with performance. These are things that need to build mechanisms to go off and to support and maintain them over time. Yeah. No problem. Hey.
You mentioned Drupal Wet and how you can't recommend it as a theme, and I understand what you're saying, that it's not that the distribution is maintained. We know that it's very well maintained.
Yeah.
But that the theme itself and the wet file libraries around it. And I also look back and I see a lot of federal government people, and this is one of the options, or maybe the only option that they have from a Drupal perspective. What would you say it would take to bring that theme to a recommender, bring that front end to it, where you would say, you know what, I would recommend this?
That's great. It's a wonderful question. Like even when it was actively being developed, I think that the web experience toolkit was drastically underfunded, and that there was a small team of people that were working around the clock and doing amazing stuff under a ridiculously small budget and time frames. They needed to go off and have a process where they had better resources, and that they were able to go off and to work over a longer period of time. And I know that they had a lot of deadlines that they needed to meet, but it was really difficult as somebody that was trying to implement that to be told, oh yeah, well we meet every Thursday, and if you're not sure, just come to this government hack space and you can go up and sit with us there. And we don't have time to do documentation, but you can sit with us and we'll try and help you solve your problems when you're dealing with it. Like, that's not the way that a mature software project should ever work. It shouldn't be a matter of having to go off and track down Paul or Laurent or whoever and go off and sit with them to go off and address the issue. You should have people who are there who are you need people who are doing the bleeding edge development work, but you also need to have a live project that's stable, that's well documented, that is leveraging existing open source best practices, so that you're not having to do something that's completely different from the rest of the universe. So the other huge problem with the Web Experience Toolkit was that you had to use the whole package and do it the wet way, or not use it at all. And you couldn't go off and pick and choose what you wanted to go off and use. Now I think that's changing, but it was really frustrating because there was all this great stuff that they were doing. Like there's this video library that did all this sort of accessible stuff with videos. But it's like, oh, well, you can't just plug that into your existing site. You have to bring in everything else. It's like, oh man, like who has it shouldn't be be an all or nothing kind of situation. You should be able to go off and to leverage other existing projects. You should try and push back into things like Colorbox or the government ideally would be in a situation where you're bundling best practices and creating something that's easy for government to use, but engaged heavily with the open source community. So all that fringy edge stuff is being done elsewhere, and best practices are being defined in a way that benefit everyone, not just the government of Canada, and so that those accessibility tools are available and are tried, and it's as easy to go off and to sort of to implement these tools and build government websites by really leveraging the best of the open source world, and not sort of having to build this crazy library from scratch is wonderful and does some amazing stuff, but then how do you maintain it, and how do you sort of keep up with like even things like HTTP2 is a framework that most of the web is moving on to, and the Web Experience Toolkit doesn't support. I opened an issue on this 2 years ago. There's been no traffic on it. It's like, really, like this is like where the internet is going, and there isn't the people to maintain it because it takes a lot of resources to maintain software. And so the more we can leverage and rebuild and reuse code and take the things that we need, whether it's other people's projects, the easier it'll be to maintain over time. Nathan?
I have to cut you off.
Oh, no!
Sadly, it's because you're already through the break and the next session's supposed to be starting.
Sorry.
Use coffee and cookies outside. You should talk to Mike out there. He's lovely and friendly. You can do the coffee.
Thanks a lot, Mike.
No problem.